The trigeminal nerve. The trigeminal nerve is the largest of the 12 cranial nerves. It is the fifth nerve, and it arises from the trigeminal ganglion or semilunar ganglion at the petrous portion of the temporal bone. Being petrous, it is very calcified. It is a mixed nerve with both motor and sensory fibers. Because it is big, the trigeminal nerve is divided into three main divisions. The V1, or the ophthalmic division, which exits the skull through the superior orbital fissure found at the orbital bones. This is the smallest division, and it is purely sensory. By being sensory, we mean it only perceives sensations. V2, or the maxillary division, exits the skull through the foramen rotundum. Remember the round foramen we found in the skull or on the skull? Similar to the ophthalmic division, the maxillary nerve is a purely sensory nerve. The largest division is the V3 or mandibular division. It exits the skull through the foramen ovale. This nerve is a mixed nerve, and it contains both sensory and motor fibers. This diagram shows you the three main branches of the trigeminal nerve. The smallest one is the ophthalmic division. The red one here is the maxillary division, or we call it now the maxillary nerve. And the green one, which is the largest, is the mandibular nerve. Another view of this is this one. This is the semilunar ganglion, or the trigeminal ganglion, which is found at the petrous portion of the temporal bone. This is the ophthalmic nerve, the maxillary nerve, and the largest, the mandibular nerve. These are the areas of innervation, or the areas that are innervated by cranial nerve 5, or the trigeminal nerve. Areas that are shaded like this are innervated by the ophthalmic nerve. As you can see, the ophthalmic division has nothing to do with the oral cavity. These are the areas innervated by the maxillary nerve, which includes the upper lip and the maxillary teeth. And these are the areas of innervation of the mandibular nerve. As you can see, it covers a wide area, and it includes the mandibular teeth, the lower lip and chin, and even up to the outer ear. So let us look at the different branches of the trigeminal nerve, starting with the ophthalmic nerve. As mentioned earlier, the ophthalmic nerve exits the skull through the orbit, through this fissure, the superior orbital fissure. And all the branches goes up, so it has nothing to do with the oral cavity. So let's just concentrate our discussion on the trigeminal nerve with the maxillary nerve and the mandibular nerve. The maxillary nerve. The maxillary nerve courses forward through the wall of the cavernous sinus and leaves the skull, again, at the foramen rotundum. After it leaves the skull through the foramen rotundum, it crosses an area called the pterygopalatine fossa area, where it anastomoses with branches from another ganglion, the sphenopalatine or pterygopalatine ganglion, which is a parasympathetic ganglion. The maxillary nerve, again, is a purely sensory nerve. To facilitate the study of the branches of this nerve, we divide the branches into four main parts. First are the branches inside the cranium, while the nerve is still inside the cranium. Second are the branches at the pterygopalatine fossa area. And we can include here the branches from the sphenopalatine ganglion. Take note that the branches from the sphenopalatine ganglion are not branches from the main trunk of the maxillary nerve. Thirdly, the branches found at the infraorbital canal, and lastly, the terminal branches, as they exit through the infraorbital foramen. Let's go back. So the first area are the branches inside the cranium, and there's only one branch, which is the nerve to the dura. Okay, and we can see that in this diagram. So let us now trace the route of the maxillary division. So this is the maxillary nerve, and this is the trigeminal ganglion found at the petrous portion of the temporal bone. So let's concentrate in this area here. So before we begin tracing the route or route of the maxillary nerve, let us first familiarize ourselves with some anatomical landmarks, beginning with the trigeminal ganglion, and which is found at the petrous portion of the temporal bone. Next will be the foramen rotundum, where the main trunk of the maxillary nerve will exit. And this area here is the pterygopalatine fossa area. This small foramina here, found at the infratemporal surface of the maxilla, if you remember our lecture in the odontoosseous structures, the posterior superior alveolar foramina, which is the entry of the terminal branches of the posterior superior alveolar nerves into the dental canals. And this is the infraorbital foramen, and it terminates into the infraorbital foramen. Sorry, this is the infraorbital canal. Okay, and it terminates into the infraorbital foramen. I am mentioning all these structures because the main trunk of the maxillary nerve will pass through all these structures. Now it's time for us to trace the route of the maxillary nerve. Beginning from the trigeminal ganglion or semilunar ganglion, that's the main trunk of the maxillary nerve, and while it is still inside the skull, it gives off a small branch to the dura. And then it exits the skull through the foramen rotundum, and once it exits the skull through the foramen rotundum, we can now say that the nerve is at the pterygopalatine fossa area. And at the pterygopalatine fossa area, there are two branches that will emerge from the main trunk. One goes up, and that is the zygomatic nerve. And the zygomatic nerve will again have two branches, that is, and these are, the zygomaticotemporal nerve, both go up, and the zygomaticofacial nerve. As you can see, these two nerves have nothing to do with the oral cavity. Another nerve from the main trunk at the pterygopalatine fossa area is the very important posterior superior alveolar nerve, or PSAN. And the terminal branches of this nerve will enter through the posterior superior alveolar foramina to give branches that will innervate the roots or pulps of the maxillary first, second, and third molars, with the exception of the mesiobuccal root of the first molar. Now, take note here. Once the posterior superior alveolar nerve is given off, the main trunk now enters a canal, which we call the infraorbital canal. Do you remember the previous slide? And once the nerve is inside the infraorbital canal, the main trunk, which is the maxillary nerve, will now change its name into the infraorbital nerve. So, this is what you should remember. The infraorbital nerve is not a branch of the maxillary nerve, but instead, it is the maxillary nerve that changed its name into infraorbital nerve once it entered the infraorbital canal. I hope that is clear. And while inside the infraorbital canal, the infraorbital nerve gives off two important branches, very important for dentists, and these are the middle superior alveolar nerve, MSAN, and the anterior superior alveolar nerve. The middle superior alveolar nerve innervates the roots of the maxillary premolars, including the mesiobuccal root of the maxillary first molar, while the anterior superior alveolar nerve will innervate the roots of the maxillary anterior teeth. These are the incisors and the cuspid. Together, the PSAN, the MSAN, and the ASAN form the so-called superior dental plexus. Okay. Now, the infraorbital nerve will exit the infraorbital canal through the infraorbital foramen by three terminal branches. One branch goes up, and that is the inferior palpebral nerve. Again, this is a Latin term, palpebra. The Latin for eyelid is palpebra. So the inferior palpebral nerve is the sensory innervation for the lower eyelid. Another terminal branch is the lateral nasal nerve, and it goes to the sides of the nose. So it is sensory to the sides of the nose. And the last terminal branch goes down, and this is the superior labial nerve. From the name, you can now guess. You can now make an intelligent guess that this is the nerve that is sensory to the upper lip. So that is the route of the maxillary nerve. Now, remember, I mentioned that at the pterygopalatine fossa area, there is another ganglion, which is the sphenopalatine ganglion. The ganglion gives off several branches containing visceral motor as well as sensory fibers to the mucous membrane of the mouth, nose, and pharynx. It has its own branches, which include the orbital branch, the posterior lateral nasal, and, very important in oral anatomy and in dentistry, the palatine nerves. Let us now look at the branches of the sphenopalatine ganglion. So, this is the pterygopalatine fossa area, and here you can find the sphenopalatine ganglion. So, one branch is the orbital nerve, which goes up to the orbit. Another is the posterior lateral nasal nerve, which goes at the posterior portion of the sides of the nose. And then we have the palatine nerves. One branch goes all the way to the anterior portion, which we call the nasopalatine nerve, which exits right behind the maxillary central incisors. Then we have the greater palatine or anterior palatine nerve, the lesser the middle palatine nerve, and the lesser or posterior palatine nerve. So these are the four palatine nerve, which are branches of the sphenopalatine ganglion: the nasopalatine, the greater palatine, the middle palatine, and the lesser palatine. And this is how the nerves look like as they exit through the hard palate through different foramina. This is the nasopalatine foramen or incisive foramen, and this is where the nasopalatine nerve exits through. Okay, and look at the branching of this nerve. Okay, and why the branching? You can see that it is sensory to the palatal mucosa of all maxillary anterior teeth. Now, even if this foramen is called the nasopalatine or incisive foramen, what is important for you to remember is you never call this nerve, the nerve that comes out of it, as the incisive nerve, because there is an incisive nerve in the mandibular arch and it will cause confusion. You call this nerve as the nasopalatine nerve. Now, let's look at the other nerves, which are branches from the sphenopalatine ganglion, this nerve. Okay? This is, if you remember, the greater or anterior palatine foramen. And from it emerges the greater palatine or anterior palatine nerve. Okay? And look at the branching of this nerve. So, it's easy to see that it is sensory to the palatal mucosa of the maxillary posterior teeth. Now, this small foramen here is the lesser or posterior palatine foramen, and from it exits two palatine nerves. One is the middle palatine nerve, and as you can see from the location and direction, it innervates something else. It innervates the soft palate area. And this one, the other nerve that comes out of the lesser palatine foramen, is the middle palatine nerve, which goes to the area of the palatine tonsils. So, the lesser or posterior palatine nerve is sensory to the palatine tonsils. So, both nerves, the middle palatine and the lesser palatine or posterior palatine nerves, exit through the lesser palatine foramen. This slide shows you the terminal branches of the main crank of the maxillary nerve. So from the infraorbital foramen exit the three terminal branches of the infraorbital nerve. And these are the inferior palpebral, the lateral nasal, and the superior labial. These nerves are superficial nerves. Okay, so that's it. That is the route or root and branches of the maxillary nerve. The next video will show you the branches of the mandibular nerve.